Okay, hi everybody. I was just saying I feel like a rock star having these things being put on me. Following on from Martin's presentation, that led really nicely into the project I'd like to share with you today. I'm not going to take up too much of your time, under 10-15 minutes. Now this is a project led and supported by the Standing Council on School Education and Early Childhood. And it was actually initiated by our Premier Weatherall, and he sort of came to his attention when we had Dr. Fraser Mustard in South Australia as our Adelaide Think in residence, and he raised the awareness around the crucial importance of brain development in the early years and the importance of parenting. And as Premier Weatherall was also a father himself, he was sort of quite confused himself about what he should be listening to with regard to messages in the early years. So he really advocated for this project on the national stage. So basically what stage one was about was looking at the neuroscience evidence to determine what messages need to be shared with families in a really sort of simple way. And as part of this work, Dr. Pam Winter from South Australia led it. She also evaluated parenting initiatives nationally to determine what messages were being shared with parents and undertook national parent focus groups and telephone interviews to determine how parents were receiving information, what they knew about early childhood, and whether the information was useful. And this was brought together in a final report. So just very quickly, just a snapshot of some of the findings. Parents sort of knew the traditional things around child development, around nurturing relationships and good nutrition, but they didn't realise that could impact their child's brain development. They thought it was all genetics, so that was quite interesting. With regard to the parenting initiatives, out of 126 reviewed, there was 98 messages going out to parents. So really, there was no surprise that one of the key findings out of stage one was that parents were really confused. They didn't know where to turn to for advice. So really took a sort of trial and error approach to their parenting and turned to family and friends for authoritative advice. So what we did with stage one is distilled the 11 key messages. Now, when I say messages, these are more like child development statements. They were meant to be a frame for a social marketing campaign, so they weren't meant to be shared in their current form. Now, these messages were endorsed by COAG and the Standing Council in December 2010. So the next stage was really looking at how we were going to share these messages with the community. And whilst this was meant to be a large-scale social marketing campaign, there really wasn't the funding around at the time. So the Standing Council sort of gave South Australia permission to do something a little bit different, and that was to seek corporate funding for a large-scale social marketing campaign to share these messages. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that social marketing campaign today and some of the research that we've undertaken in that area. And also another key resource that we're developing as part of this campaign, which is a toolkit for practitioners working with families. Before I go on, I just want to say that because of the cross-disciplinary nature of this, it was really important that we had a steering group comprised of all the ministerial committees providing advice on this, so they all felt that they had some kind of ownership over this work. So that was quite a feat in itself to get all these ministerial committees together, and it's been fun working with, although they have been very supportive. Now the aim, I'll just talk about the toolkit. It's really important that we're all saying the same thing, using the same language, starting from the same starting point. So the aim of the toolkit is to share the early childhood development story, but to commence from the same starting point, as I said. So what we've got is a definition, a conceptual foundation, and some key high-level principles that are part of this work, and some strategic planning and evaluation tips. Now this is a key part of the social marketing campaign. It's trying to reduce duplication by referencing other key material, and it's written in a language of partnership. We're not setting ourselves up as experts. So I'd just like to move on to the social marketing campaign now. Before we moved forward, we really had to determine how we could frame these messages to resonate with families. We didn't want to alienate them, and we didn't want to scare them by saying that if they don't get it right in those first 5 years, their children are doomed, as Martin had said earlier. So we commissioned the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, the RACY, to undertake further research with families around these key messages. They then partnered with TNS Global Marketing, who are experts in behaviour change and who are in the global task force around behaviour change, to do further research. Before I sort of share a bit of that research with you, I just want to explain what we mean by social marketing campaign. It's not just a top-down approach. That is one element of it. It really involves a grassroots element as well, that service intervention part. So it needs to be a push up and a push down. So it's multi-layered. And at the service agency engagement level, that's where we see the parenting toolkit fitting in. So again, right from the bottom going up, we're all speaking the same language and saying the same messages. Whilst I said it was important to have a government reference group that was multidisciplinary, we also knew that we had to get some really key non-governments on board as well, so they were singing the same tune. So we had a reference group providing advice on the social marketing plan as well, with the Parent Research Centre, the Raising Children Network, the Centre for Community Child Health, among others, as you can see by the list there. Now, the research methodology that TNS and ERASER used was quite rigorous. They did desktop research to put some really simple parenting behaviours against those child development statements. They undertook an online survey with 1,000 parents to see where they were with those behaviours and how we needed to frame the messages, whether we needed to educate or motivate, etc. There was then some in-depth interviews done in people's homes. And the researcher from TNS allocated 2.5 hours per family, but families aren't neat, so sometimes you spend the whole day there. And I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the work done by TNS was pro bono. So these are the key behaviours that were put alongside the child development statements, and then they were grouped into play, care, learn, talk. And I just want to emphasise that this was done for simplicity. All of these are interrelated. You learn when you play, when you talk, etc. And they're all underpinned by relationships, nurturing relationships. And down the track, I'll talk a bit about the creative material. And all the creative material is around interaction between the parent and the child. So we're really building on that nurturing relationship element. Now, I just wanted to show you some of the findings from the online survey. This was quite a complex system of interpretation, which I don't understand in depth, but what this is saying is it works that like 60% of parents were saying that they know they should be consistent with their children, but they're not. The smacking my child one was sort of put in there a little bit controversially, just to see where parents sat, and interestingly 63% said that they smacked their children but knew that they probably shouldn't. It then goes down to parents were self-reporting that they understood that children needed good nutrition and they did abide by this. But interestingly enough, the TNS researcher, sometimes, as I said, spent all day there, should be making cups of tea, doing things, opening cupboards, and what parents were saying wasn't sort of coming through in their cupboards, like she was doing a bit of snooping. And so we realised that there's probably still a little bit of education that needed to be done there. So we just went out firstly with the statements themselves just to see how people felt about them, and it was really interesting. Some were just completely misunderstood. Like the first 5 years last a lifetime. Parents just thought that, really? Does it go on forever? Does it never end? They just thought like it was lifetime. Some were just like, yeah, we know that, but so what? About the learning and the reading, etc. And some were just outright rejected. One of that was around the self-control that Martin was talking about. Was interesting, but I think it was just the language used there. Once we sort of talked about that being routines and setting limits, parents were sort of more open to that. And the one that was completely rejected was one around maths. They really related it to their own learnings around maths, and the fact they didn't understand it, they just didn't want to go there with their children. But once we explained that one of the first things they did with their children was count their little fingers and toes when they were born, they then realised that, oh yeah, I do that. Or the sorting with blocks and stuff, they're like, oh yeah, I do that as well. So it was about the way those messages were framed. So what else did we find out? Parents don't think in years, they think in milestones, when their child first talks, walks, etc. And all their children are different. They really resisted the notion that their first, second and third child were the same. So that had major implications for our campaign. And it's always about how they were parented, whether that was negatively or positively. We really had to take that into account. So it came through really clearly to us that grandparents are a primary, secondary audience. Parents are well-intentioned, but have an underlying sense of guilt that they're not doing enough. And I think most of us that work with families will understand that. And I think ourselves, we always feel like we could be doing more. They don't like to be judged, but they love judging others, and they were quite open about that. And I think that's human nature as well. I think we're all a bit like that. And they hated people setting themselves up at experts. They hated experts lecturing them, telling them what to do. But they valued other parents. They thought other parents had good ideas. And they weren't in the market for new information unless there was an issue there. So for us, from the campaign perspective, we knew we had to create a compelling hook. So what TNS then did was come up with some statements that we then retested through focus groups and online discussion boards. And I won't go through these, but we focused on validating parents' role, self-efficacy, empathy, aspiration and incentive, and the new information, the brain story. One thing I didn't mention was the word neuroscience was polarising. It came through really clearly, do not use that word. But interestingly enough, the rational brain story had resonance with parents. So after testing those statements, what came through again supported the first lot of research. Generalising parents doesn't work. Specific behaviours, they don't like the focus on one behaviour. They liked all the behaviours. They saw that as a spectrum of child development and the holistic approach. Any hint of condescending language or judgment just was never going to work, so stay away from guilt-inducing in any way through the campaign. What did work was empathy. But we had to be careful because if we empathised too much, parents went into victim mode. So it was about walking that balance. Control and choice. They wanted to have some control over what they did with their children and some choice. As I said, the holistic nature, positive and hopeful, and the rational brain story. So the recommendation for our campaign was to have different behaviours associated with optimum parenting promoted from an overarching rational style brain story. So we want to engage parents with the campaign, but then also refer them to a credible website such as the Raising Children website to get some more activities and ideas of what to do. As I said before, this was the target audience for the campaign. Grandparents are secondary, parents of older children, practitioners, young adults, down to the whole of the population. So what's next? We engaged through a competitive process, BCM, a Brisbane creative agency, who came up with some creative material. And I think they've just nailed it. I can't share it with you today because it's just going through the ministerial committees for endorsement. But they're very simple behaviours, and we've made sure they're incorporated into everyday activities. Because one thing parents were saying to us is they weren't going to make time to sit down and play. If we framed it in a way that was everyday activity, like counting, finding paired socks and constantly interacting with your child, they found that they could do that. Once we get them endorsed, we'll be looking to pilot the campaign for 2 years before it rolls out into full implementation, and ideally would love to have the pilot in South Australia. And that's it for me today. That was a very quick rush through the project, but please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any more questions. I'll be really happy to answer them. Thank you.